Jump right into it. Why do humans need social interaction?
I'm a neuroscientist by training, but I tend to think of things from this evolutionary lens. In order to keep us alive and make sure that we were sticking together, our brains have this built-in social reward system that we feel good being around others.
I was looking at another stat the other day. Number of adults actually going out and meeting someone is down like 40% in the last 30 years.
In that socializing isn't just social reward, right? I've talked about this sort of one cluster of neurotransmitters in this brain system, but there's a lot more, a ton more to socializing than
What determines how much empathy we feel? Well, not necessarily the levels of empathy, but how come we instantly empathize with some people but struggle with others? Welcome back to Medical Centric. Today we're asking a big question. Why do our brains need friends? To answer it, we're joined by Dr. Ben Rein, PhD, Stanford-trained neuroscientist, science educator, and the author of the book, Why Brains Need Friends. You may have known him from TikTok, Instagram, or YouTube, where he makes brain science fun and easy to understand. In this episode, we'll explore empathy, emotional contagion, and the impact of social media, and even why our bonds with dogs run so deep. Welcome, Dr. Ben Rein. Glad to have you.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, right on. And my dog just entered the room. She's here at the bottom of my camera. I'm not sure if you can see her or not, but maybe in the wide view. But yeah, she's here to cheer me on, and she has some things to say about the neuroscience of dog-human relationships.
That's brilliant. Let's jump right into it. Why do humans need social interaction? Why does social interaction, how does it affect our brain?
Yeah. So the reason why we are better together, or at least we are happier together, I can say, is because we are a social species. We survive best in groups. And so, I'm a neuroscientist by training, but I tend to think of things from this evolutionary lens, right? Because there's so many features of our brains and bodies that if you look back at, the circumstances humans were placed in, 10, 20, 30, 100, 200,000 years ago, you could say, oh, that's why we have that feature, because it was helpful for surviving at that time. And, nowadays we're not really evolving anymore because instead of us changing to our environment, we are changing our environment to us. So, millions of years ago, our human-like ancestors were best at surviving in groups. We have all these great features that make us really excellent at communicating and understanding each other. And that's really helpful for when you're defending yourself or you're hunting prey. We can think about how amazing it is that if I make a facial expression, you can say, he's in pain, he's been hurt. Okay, he's out of the fight. Now I need to fight on my own. Something like that. It's just amazing to think about how empathy and working together and all of these features we have build up into this powerful, robust social animal that we are. And so in order to keep us alive and make sure that we were sticking together, our brains have this built-in social reward system that we feel good being around others. That was super valuable long ago. And now it doesn't really matter if we're in groups anymore because we will survive regardless. But it's still a part of what makes us us and why our brains are so happy around others and super unhappy around when we're left alone for too long. Because similarly, in ancient world, being alone was a legitimate threat signal. It was, you are by yourself, you are more vulnerable to death, sound the alarms, you need to seek community. And so being isolated actually triggers a stress response in the brain and body, which is why I'm so concerned about the current world we're living in, where people are more isolated than ever before, have fewer friends, and the data are basically showing a general downward trend as far as how robust our social lives are. And that's a major problem.
Right. I was looking at another stat the other day. Number of adults actually going out and meeting someone is down like 40% in the last 30 years. That's insane. 40% is, I would understand we have Netflix and PlayStation and, people want to stay in, but 40% is astounding. So that leads to an obvious question. Are we drifting into an age of loneliness? Is there a real danger that possess to our health and happiness then?
Yeah. I mean, we are in an age of loneliness already. In the US, the US Surgeon General announced a couple of years back that we are in a loneliness epidemic. And this is a serious problem. I mean, there's no question. If you look at the data, like it's wild. People are just spending way more time alone instead of with people, and that makes a difference. Um, if you look at the rates of anxiety and depression, they've been rising over the last decade or so. I'm a scientist. We're not going to say, oh, that's definitely because people are isolated, but we are finding people are spending less time together and they are feeling more anxious and depressed. And there is scientific data showing that the more isolated someone is, the worse their anxiety and depression scores are. So being alone definitely makes us feel bad. And what's even more concerning, there's so many concerning things about this. For those who aren't familiar or haven't come across my materials before, I'm a neuroscientist and I study the neuroscience of social behavior. So I've been doing this for like a decade and I understand this field really well. And so the reason I wrote this book, Why Brains Need Friends, is to get this message out there because I am concerned and it's a severe problem. And one of the reasons why I'm concerned is because we don't take it very seriously. We're really not doing anything about it. Like we've heard the news, we've heard the podcasts, we've heard that it's, bad for us to be isolated, but what are we actually doing about it? And so I'm hoping that by showing people this window into the neuroscience and the biology of what's actually happening and giving you an understanding of what's at stake there, people may be more motivated because I guess what's happening now isn't enough. And, there are a lot of biological changes that happen when we are isolated. You know, there's a lot of like correlational studies showing that people who are isolated are, like I said, they're at higher risk of depression, anxiety. Also, I mean, beyond mood, we've been talking about mood so far, the actual health consequences. Like there are studies where they've tracked people, hundreds of thousands of people for a decade or so, and they just looked at pure mortality. How likely is someone to die by any cause? And when they segment them by how isolated they were, they found that isolated people were 50% more likely to die by any cause. Why? Why is that, right? Like what's actually happening that's making that increasing the risk of death so much in these people? Well, I mentioned before that isolation is perceived by the body as stress. So what happens when we're chronically stressed, when we're chronically isolated, is it's often leading to a lot of negative health effects, one being chronic inflammation, because the body's stress response, cortisol is, this main mechanism of driving the stress response. Cortisol is anti-inflammatory. So when you have stress, cortisol reduces inflammation, which is a good thing. It's meant to prepare your body to take on whatever challenge is stressing you. But when you have chronic cortisol levels that are elevated, so let's say if you're isolated for a long period and your cortisol levels remain high, eventually the tissues of your body, they need to just kind of ignore that signal. They need to be like, okay, it's time to get back to regular operating business. And so the tissues become desensitized to that cortisol, which means that anti-inflammatory effect goes away. And so over time, if you have elevated cortisol, it's no longer suppressing inflammation. One of the body's anti-inflammatory systems is now out of order. And so you can see a rise in inflammation and chronic inflammation. And there are a bunch of studies linking this inflammation with, negative health effects and, increased risk of dementia and heart disease and all sorts of basically dysfunction of critical organs that drive us, like our brains and hearts and other things. And so I believe that when people are isolated for a long time, it's basically just kind of compromising their health on a broad systemic scale, leading to,
It's not just mental health, if you will, right?
yeah, it's not just mental health. I mean, mental health is a part of brain health, right? If you are happy, your brain is functioning well, right? Or I guess it's a part of it, right? But I'm talking more now about just brain health, this organ that controls everything we do. How is the function of that organ? Are the neurons effective at communicating with each other? Is synaptic signaling happening properly? Or is the clearance of unwanted stuff happening properly? Those types of things, like just the organ's health, seems to be maybe compromised by long-term isolation. And starting with COVID and even before COVID, all these other societal changes, we're heading deeper and deeper into this really kind of unhealthy area.
Why does when we have like a simple chat with our friends make us feel good? Like, I mean, I understand if we like a person, but what goes in our brain that's responsible for that kind of boost?
Yeah, so that I mentioned before that we have this social reward system in our brains. Many people think of dopamine as, this, like, I don't know, I've heard it called like a happy hormone or things like that. But I think lately people are starting to realize that's really not true. What dopamine actually is this like reinforcer. It's the brain's reinforcement system. Reinforcement meaning it's trying to reinforce a behavior. So you eat a healthy, nutritious meal, and dopamine is released in your brain to tell you, hey, that was good for us. Let's do that again. It's reinforcing that you'll do that thing again. So dopamine is one of the neurotransmitters that underlies this idea of social reward. So it's reinforcing social interactions. So when we're around people and we're having a good, pleasant social time, there are three neurotransmitters, one of them being dopamine, and it's probably that reinforcing part. The other is oxytocin. Oxytocin is actually upstream of dopamine. So when oxytocin is released, it's, this social bonding, love sort of hormone. It's also a neurotransmitter in the brain. And oxytocin causes dopamine to be released, and it also causes serotonin to be released. And what I want to point out about that, again, this is very kind of broad strokes, but one of the only drugs in the world that does the same thing as oxytocin, that drives serotonin and dopamine release at the same time, MDMA, ecstasy. Many people are familiar with ecstasy, MDMA. This drug drives this sort of euphoric feeling and also a sense of connectivity. And it's called an empathogen. It makes people more empathic, makes people feel more connected with each other. And so the fact that oxytocin is acting on some of the same brain systems as MDMA tells you a lot about how the brain is wired to make us feel good and reward us for connection. It's driving the release of these neurotransmitters that the brain is basically processing and interpreting as pleasant and reinforcing. And that's kind of what it all comes down to. When you socialize, especially when you have like pleasant, positive interactions, your brain, which is locked away in the darkness of your skull and is only processing this social interaction and the world around you in chemical signals. It doesn't know what's happening. It just gets chemical signals, really. Those chemical signals are the ones that tell the brain, this is good, this is rewarding, let's do this again. And so you feel better after interacting, probably because of these pleasurable, rewarding neurotransmitters that socializing drives.
Is it the same brain function in kids? Like, why does social interaction, how does they shape kids when they're growing up? I'm guessing a good example could be kids that are homeschooled, because a lot of people do not want to send their kids to school. And obviously that leads to, less social interaction, especially if they're a single child, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Interaction in early life is very, very important. And it's a good question and a good, well-timed question, because it allows me to explain that socializing isn't just social reward, right? I've talked about this sort of one cluster of neurotransmitters in this brain system, but there's a ton more to socializing than just, oh, this feels good. And anybody who has ever socialized with another human knows this anecdotally, right? It's not just, this is a rush of pleasure. There's so much more. And a lot of that comes down to like social cognition. So if you're interacting with someone, it's a lot of work. Your brain is processing a ton of information. Their, what they're saying, their vocal tone, their body language, all these cues. You're trying to think about your own body language. What am I doing with my arms? And what is this the right tone? It's a huge workout for the brain. And we have other brain areas that are devoted to this social cognition. The major one being the prefrontal cortex, sort of frontal area. This really like executive, intelligent, superhuman brain area. And so this brain area is responsible for sort of understanding things about other people, setting boundaries, and understanding the sort of moral limits, what's respectful, what's disrespectful to do. And socializing in early life, to come back to your question, seems to be very critical for sort of shaping the development of this brain area. People have probably heard, the prefrontal cortex doesn't stop developing until you're 25. That's kind of very hand wavy. It's not like you turn 25 and it's like, boom, you're done. No more plasticity ever before, or ever again. But what it really means is that while your other brain areas they start out really, really, really plastic, so they can be shaped by the world around you. And then as you get older, they turn down that plasticity and they kind of mellow out into this adult level of decreased plasticity. There's less flexibility. The prefrontal cortex remains flexible for longer, much longer, until like about 25, let's say. but it's kind of gradually fading as we're getting into that mid-20s range.
Right. There's no like hard day when it's like stop developing.
Yeah, right. Exactly. It's not like done. But anyways, so the fact that the prefrontal cortex is flexible longer kind of explains a lot of this human experience that you see. You see people when they go from high school to college, or I'll use myself as the example. I don't want to disparage any group of people, but I made very stupid decisions when I was in high school, when I was in college. Naive decisions, I should say, uninformed decisions, and careless decisions. And that's probably because this is kind of a cliche in social media, but it's true. Like, my brain wasn't fully developed, right? This important lobe that's driving these really like smart functions and thoughtful decisions and planning wasn't fully there. And socializing in early life seems to be important for that process, for shaping the development of the prefrontal cortex. And so there's studies, for instance, in mice, where if you isolate mice for a certain part of their life, it's the postnatal day 21 to 35. So when they're 3 to 5 weeks old, which is roughly equivalent to like human adolescence. So I don't know, this is very hand wavy, but let's say like 6 to 10 years old. If they're isolated during that period, as adults, they show this whole like abnormal function and structure of their prefrontal cortex. The neurons aren't communicating properly. And if you look at the actual synapses, they're just not like mature. It's just evident that this brain area has not been exercised as much as it really needed to properly shape its development. Because in the beginning, the brain is kind of like a muscle. Well, it's always like a muscle, but in the beginning, it's sort of like the muscle. How you train the muscle determines how the brain is shaped, right? And so if you're not having social interactions, you're kind of missing out on this important training for the brain, which is really critical. And interestingly, also studies in mice show that if you delay that isolation to like 5 to 7 weeks, for instance, or I think it may be 7 to 9 weeks later in life when they're more grown up, the mice don't show that problem with the prefrontal cortex. There's like this critical period early in life where they need to have interaction for their prefrontal cortex to function properly. And if that isolation happens later, the prefrontal cortex is fine. So extrapolating this to humans, there's similarly research in humans showing that children who were isolated in early life show a smaller volume of the prefrontal cortex. And they also are, there are some case studies of these kids who are basically more likely to act out and do things that are sort of socially frowned upon, I suppose. They're more likely to steal from people. They're more likely to like bully and things like that, which again lines up with this idea that this brain area that sets boundaries and helps you understand the world around you and how to interact and how not to interact wasn't getting the shaping that it needed. And so I'm a big proponent of socializing children at a young age. There's also plenty of evidence that there is this critical period in early life, the first couple of years of life, where socializing is especially, I should say, the brain is especially receptive to social interaction. It's taking in more information and just allowing itself to be shaped more. So it's really important to, be building social interaction into the lifestyle of children, because it's critical for their brain support.
Well, we know all this, the information you've shared. Knowing all this, how can people leverage that social connection for their well-being? So if someone's an introvert listening to you, they understand how important it is. How can, like, go out and meet people is not like the answer that everybody's going to end up with, right? So can you talk a little bit about how can we leverage that information into like actual well-being?
Yeah, I mean, one of the concerns that I have, you've just hit on, is that people will hear about, my book and the kind of message I'm sharing, and they'll be like, all right, screw this guy, screw this information. It sounds like I need to socialize every day and make it a focal point of my life, or else I'm going to die young. And if I want to live to 120, I should socialize constantly. That's really not the case. The truth is that we're all different. We all have different levels of extroversion. Some of us are very extroverted. Some of us are very introverted. I happen to be very extroverted. And what that means is that, what that actually definitionally means is that I enjoy interaction more. I get more joy and excitement from it than an introvert. And there are plenty of people out there who are very introverted, and going to a party or socializing for a couple hours is like way more than enough for them, and they're ready to go home. What it's important to think about is that we should all understand and recognize where we exist on this continuum from introverted to extroverted, and try to build the appropriate sort of cadence of socializing to fit your brain's needs. It's not that everybody should be socializing day in and day in and day out all the time, because that's that can be also very bad for you. You don't want to deplete yourself, and there's plenty of evidence that people who are when introverted people are asked to do that, they feel worse. They're exhausted, they feel sort of, they don't feel genuine. They feel like they've kind of lost their authentic sense of self.
Yeah, because they're kind of pushing themselves to do something they don't want, and that might have like negative impacts on the brain, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, exactly. Right. Like there's a, classic study Robert Sapol always talks about where they had two groups of, I think it was rats, either rats or mice, and they had them run on a spinning wheel. And in one case, the rats were just kind of exposed to the wheel and they could run on it whenever they want. And that's how they got their exercise. And in other cases, they were forced to run on the wheel. And they found that when the rats were forced, even though they were doing the exact same exercise regimen, they didn't show a bunch of these beneficial health effects of exercise. And it's just an interesting anecdote and scientific story on the importance of like your perception and your intent, right? So yeah, if you're forced into socializing, it's probably, socializing and exercise are both similar in that they're good for the brain. But if you're forced to do it, yeah, it probably loses those effects. That's actually an interesting scientific question to ask. But anyways, so what I encourage in the book, and I have a couple different tools in the book for this specifically. One is a trait extroversion scale. So there are, these assessments where you can figure out, are you introverted, extroverted, in the middle? And so there's a bunch of questions, you can answer them, and it'll give you a score to help you understand. And based on that, you should essentially be trying to build in the right amount of interaction for yourself. For someone really extroverted, scoring higher on that test, it's going to be more interaction. For someone less extroverted, it's going to be less interaction. It's okay if you're an introverted person and socializing, once a week, getting an hour-long coffee with a friend, or even once a month, if that's enough, that's okay. It's about making sure you're meeting that.
And that might be all you need, right?
Yeah.
I wanna switch gears and talk about empathy. So what's really going on in our brain when we feel it? Is it a strength? Is it weakness? Like how do you? Yeah, tell us more about that.
Yeah. I think some time ago, not long ago, Elon Musk, I believe, posted that empathy was a weakness, and that is completely wrong. I can understand maybe in certain business settings that caring about the person on the other side of the desk could make you weak, sure. But as for the human race, empathy is a tremendous strength. And I already actually mentioned this at the beginning when I said that, you can, if you and I are both in combat against a saber-toothed tiger or whatever, or in modern times, let's say we both fall into the pit at a zoo and we're fighting a lion, right? And you can look at me and you can tell by the face I'm making that I'm hurt, then okay, this is now a one-man fight. And or on the other hand, if you're working with a group of people and you can read the eyes of people where they're looking, and let's say I look at the lion's foot and then I look at you and I kind of like make an expression, you can know, oh, let me look at the lion's foot, and you look and it's it's bleeding and I'm trying to signal something to you, right? This is empathy. This is all empathy. Empathy is the process of being able to step into someone else's mind space and either just understand what they're telling you, or actually, sorry, that's wrong. Understand what they're thinking and feeling, or feel what they are feeling. And so this, when it comes to the neuroscience of empathy, it's really quite interesting, because research shows that when we feel what someone else is feeling, we often share a similar brain state. So for instance, in pain, if you see someone experiencing something painful, your brain pattern, your activity in your brain is quite similar to the brain activity that happens when you are in pain yourself. And that kind of makes sense, because if you've ever observed something painful, right? Like I'm a football fan, American football. And, sometimes there's just these moments where somebody gets tackled awkwardly and, their leg bends the wrong way. And for me, that is like the absolute worst thing. I cannot stand it because I feel repulsed, right? There's something emotionally uncomfortable about that experience. That's probably the brain areas that are associated with pain activating in my brain as an observer. But the thing is that's important to realize here is obviously it's not the exact same brain areas, right? If it was, I would be screaming and holding my leg, right? That would be horrible. And I actually, I have this argument, by the way, based on that we are in the Goldilocks zone of empathy. We have just the right amount of empathy. Because if we had more and it was like that, and I truly felt like my leg was broken, that's different because I'm watching on TV. But let's say if this was happening in person, that would be too overwhelming for me to be motivated to help that person, right? The doctors and nurses would be out of a job, or they wouldn't want to have a job, because if a patient came in with a gunshot wound and they felt like they've been shot, how could they possibly provide care, right? But on the other hand, if we felt no empathy, if seeing that person with the gunshot wound made me feel nothing, then I would not be motivated to help them, other than if I was a doctor and I was being paid a salary to do it. But, I'm thinking evolutionarily, right? Hundreds of thousands of years ago, you have to have some sort of personal incentive to step in and help somebody who's hurt. And often that incentive may be, gosh, I feel bad seeing this person in pain. If I help them, it will alleviate my suffering. So I think that this empathy we're given, like I just said, is a tremendous strength. It's one of the key things that supports a survival in groups, and it's one of the reasons why we are pretty much still here today and so good at working together in groups.
So I guess my next question comes, obviously it leads to what determines how much empathy we feel? Well, not necessarily the levels of empathy, but how come we instantly empathize with some people but struggle with others? Like, you could see two complete strangers and in a similar condition, but the levels of empathy we feel for both individuals could be different. What happens in our brain and why do we make those choices?
The brain is very selective about empathy. At least in its levels of empathy, right? It's rare that if you are a person with normal levels of empathy, it's rare that you'll not feel no empathy for someone. But it's very, very likely that you'll feel more for certain people and less for others. And what that often comes down to is how similar how similar you are to that person, or at least how similar you perceive that you are. Actually, that's way more important than, if you perceive yourself as dissimilar, regardless of how similar you actually are, your brain will experience less empathy. So for example, if you're both Caucasian Americans living in the same city, you have so much in common. But if you see that person's wearing a t-shirt with supporting the opposing political candidate that you don't like, suddenly your brain creates this massive divide, and it's like, screw that person. That's a big problem we're facing in America right now that I really am not a big fan of. And honestly, one of my motivations to write this book is that I feel we're becoming so divided by kind of silly human made factors. We are a species wired for social connection, and yet we've kind of created this system of politics and then made it so divisive that we are losing this shared identity of being humans and being on the same team in so many ways. Anyways, so it's not just politics, of course. It can be race, sexuality, religion, whatever. If you perceive someone as being more unlike you, your brain is going to be less effective at engaging those empathy related areas. And again, this also has evolutionary origins. When you think about, a long time ago, when we were living in these sort of tribal conditions, if you saw a member of the rival tribe that was hurt, it's actually not in your best interest to help them. They are different from you. And so your brain should say, I'm not going to help them. If I help them, they could, stab me in the back. They could learn about my tribe. There's all sorts of ways that they could take advantage of you. And so, whereas in your tribe, if someone was hurt, the survival of the people around you in your tribe is directly related to your survival. So if you don't care about them and you let them all die and you feel no empathy, it's very likely that you're going to die. And so I think there's probably this evolutionary selection for that type of brain, a brain that favors the in-group and dismisses the out-group. And that was the brain that was the most survival, or it was survival of the fittest, right? That was the most fit type of brain. And so now, a long, long time later, we have this brain because those were the humans that survived. But we live in these very, very different blended, mixed cultures now, where we are not in tribes anymore, but we are still very good at noticing when someone is different. And, I think it's important for people to understand that this kind of fundamental flaw is built into the brain. At least it's a flaw in modern society, but it's also not something that you have to be stuck with. You can override these systems and say, okay, yeah, I may not really care, but let me think about, is this actually the right thing to do to not care? Can I will myself into caring? And oftentimes you can. I mean, if you think about the situation, you imagine yourself in that position, it's pretty easy to understand, oh yeah, you know what, I didn't really feel it before, but what this person's going through is really, really bad. And, you can override those impulses to ignore.
Talked about levels of empathy, right? Is that something you can train and grow? Or are we born with like set levels of empathy?
Yeah, you can train your empathy. There are actually scientifically proven approaches and like trainings to enhance empathy. And, some of these come from like really prolific empathy researchers like Tanya Singer, where, they basically have taken people, put them through these kind of protocols where they have to do some exercises. Some of these things are like meditations. Some of these things are, like actual interpersonal interactions. They're very guided. And at the end of these experiences, it's like I think it was like a 90-day trial they did, or program they did. These people actually showed higher levels of compassion, empathy, and actually showed structural brain changes in these areas that are associated with empathy. So it's very possible to train your empathy even as an adult, because like I said, in early life, we have tons of plasticity. And as we grow older, that plasticity dwindles, but our brains remain very plastic, although it can be difficult. It is definitely, everyone knows what it's like to try to break a habit or start a new habit. New Year's resolutions notoriously fail because it's difficult to train the brain. Whereas it might be easier for a child with a very plastic brain to get into a routine. But anyways, it's encouraging to know that even despite that, the adult brain is capable of sort of renewing its capacity for empathy.
And I'm guessing the older you are, the harder it gets, right? It's not just adults versus kids, right? If you're 75 years old and you've been this mean and rude person all your life, it's probably going to be harder for you to all of a sudden, you know, just wave at your neighbors every morning, right?
Yeah, what's that Tom Hanks movie? I read the book too. It came out a couple of years ago, but he's like this curmudgeon old guy, and his wife died, and he ends up like basically doing what you're talking about. Like does this full like 180 turnaround and becomes like this super loving character. Gosh, I can't remember the movie, but it's the guy's name, whatever. I'm sure people listening will be like, I know what that is. Anyways, there's no like, I don't think there's any definite evidence on this question that I can refer to, like this particular scientific study asked that question. But theoretically, it's probably true. I mean, because the brain gradually gets less and less plastic as we get older. And so by the time we're, 75, 80, our brains are much less plastic. And the reason for that is because it's expensive. It's energetically expensive for the brain to be changing and modifying synapses all the time. And by the time you're 80 years old, your brain has 80 years of heuristics and predictions and learning of what the world around you is like, that it's like by this point that energy is better used elsewhere. I'm 80 years old, I've got a cane, I don't need to be using the energy here, I need to be using the energy here in all these places, my legs. So yeah, there's less plasticity, but it's probably, certainly people can still change. There is definitely still a great capacity for change, and plenty of like interventions, even social interventions, where making spending more time socializing, for instance, can still have beneficial effects. It's not like it's a total lost cause, but as for like a total personality change, that would be unlikely, I would say.
Let's move on to animals. I know that's one thing you're really excited about. And do animals truly feel empathy and compassion, or are we just projecting human emotions onto them?
Great question. we can't say for sure, right? Animals feel empathy and compassion because we can't talk to them. But what we can do is look at the brain activity. And there are plenty of examples. So I have a whole chapter in the book of social behavior in animals, answering the question of, first, are animals capable of doing behaviors that look like empathy and compassion, right? And they are. And there's so many great examples from the world of science, and I've packaged them all into that chapter. And I absolutely adore that chapter because I love animals. But they can definitely look like they're experiencing empathy and compassion. What if you measure their brains? And that question has also been answered. Many researchers have done this, but for instance, one of my close friends, her name's Dr. Monique Smith. She's a professor at UC San Diego. She discovered this behavior that looked like empathy in mice. And when she looked at the activity in their brains while they were going through that empathy-like behavior, she saw increased activity in two areas: the anterior cingulate cortex and also the insular cortex. The reason those two areas matter is because in human beings, put through specific empathy tasks in brain scanners, those are the two areas that also light up. And so the fact that empathy related brain areas in humans are also showing activity in these animals while they're doing empathic, behaviors that resemble empathy, it's pretty likely that they are actually experiencing empathy and compassion. And I think, I believe it's chapter 7. I can double check. I have the book here. I'm not going to check now, but after you read this chapter that really summarizes all the evidence, I don't think there's any way you could say, I don't think so. It's pretty remarkable that the different ways that caring for each other manifests throughout the animal kingdom, all the way from, of course, primates and, these dolphins and elephants, these animals that people often think of as very intelligent, but all the way down to mice and like minnows, zebrafish. It's really incredible.
Well, with things changing so fast and humans changing into this tech world where this thing didn't exist 40 years ago, forget about hundreds of thousand years ago. So my next question becomes, how does the brain react to the virtual interaction, like what we're doing right now? This could have been in person. Does our brain look at it in the same way, or is there a difference as to in person versus, let's say, a Zoom call?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's not enough neuroscience research on this yet, in my opinion, because it is sort of a new thing, and especially social media, right? There's this an explosion lately of how much time we're spending online, and in new ways. But I would guarantee you that if you and I sat down for this conversation in person and had, let's say we had EEG electrodes measuring brain activity, or if we had those same EEG electrodes on right now, guarantee there's going to be some differences, because it's just different. We are missing certain social cues. There's a lot that's stripped out of the interactions, and it's funny because you mentioned like we've been doing this for only like 40 years out of like 2 million or something. When the computer was first introduced, some prudent scientists did these experiments where they kind of had people interact online versus in person just to see what's going on. They called it computer mediated communication, CMC. So there's this like early field of social behavior in the 1980s. And what they found, among other things, was that when people interacted online, their behaviors like totally changed. They became more likely to swear. They became more hostile. All these just abnormal, like kind of primitive behaviors of just, or like maybe not primitive, but more like uninhibited and kind of like juvenile, right? There's just this change when you are not in front of the person and you can't see the person. You behave differently, especially in conditions of anonymity when they're anonymous. And, fast forward now 40 plus years, here we are with social media. You look on social media and you think, I propose this idea in the book that like we are more connected than ever before. You can interact with anybody around the globe. And you would think that would probably be a vessel for peace, right? Like how the problem is miscommunication, I'm sure. Now we can communicate, everything's great. No way. It's like worse than ever. Like we argue with each other, we harass each other, we abuse each other. The rates of online abuse are tremendously high. Everybody experiences some harassment. I think it's like 50%, 51%, I believe, of American teens have experienced harassment online in just the last year. It's really bad. And I think that part of the reason for that is because our brains are just not equipped for that type of interaction. And I actually I proposed this theory. I call it the virtual disengagement hypothesis. As a empathy scientist, a researcher, I study empathy myself in my research, and also a person who posts online. And I've posted, I don't know, hundreds of videos. I have over 1 million followers. I was kind of straddling this strange space of like studying the neurobiology of empathy, but then experiencing this really strange, bizarre behavior of people on the internet. Because of course, people comment all the time. I'm sure you experience this. People will just throw horrible, mean comments out there all the time, super careless, thoughtless. And I thought, how interesting is that? I wonder if there's something about this virtual interaction that is disengaging our empathy regions in our brain. And so I put together this paper and this hypothesis and published it, where I basically string together all the existing evidence that interacting online disengages those empathy areas. And I proposed it as a hypothesis and basically said, researchers, we should really start studying this. But I'm planning projects coming up soon to start really investigating that myself. And I think it's interesting because also we were just talking about empathy and compassion in animals. Well, there are studies where, for instance, if you give a mouse two options, it can either press lever A, lever 1, let's call it, and that gives them a treat, or they can press lever 2, and that gives them a treat, and also gives a mouse on the other side of a wall a clear barrier so they can see the mouse. It also gives them a treat. So that's one of the examples of this sort of compassionate behavior, because mice will, for no reason, they will prefer to press lever 2. They will prefer to share the treat with their friend. But here's the thing. If you replace the clear barrier between the two mice with an opaque barrier, they can no longer see each other, smell each other, the mice will start to prefer the first lever. Even though they know that the mouse on the other side is getting a treat, they just kind of stop caring. If they can't be seen doing it, if they can't be seen by the other mouse doing them a favor, they kind of lose motivation and they go over to lever 1.
I mean that explains the online behavior you're talking about, right? Like we're talking to someone who we don't know, but like if the same person was sitting in front of us right now, we would probably not be that mean, right?
Exactly. And yeah, the reason I bring up that example is because, think about it. Like, obviously the cognitive programs, the brain activity of a mouse is totally different from a human, right? It's much more, simple, and it's more reliant on just sort of like, I don't know, basic programming and biology, right? I would say that humans, our behaviors are much more complex, and we're also more shaped by our experiences in more complex ways. Whereas mice, something with an animal like a mouse, is more kind of reliant on these like innate programs that are just like get food, mate, all those things, where we have this like added layer on top of it. So the fact that in this very basic programmed brain, the same behavior manifests where they are less nice to an animal they can't see, we are less nice to other humans we can't see on social media. It just tells me that this is just an inherent property of biology, and how all brains on Earth, all life forms, or at least most life forms, operate. I think there's less reason to care for an invisible being. And so I think this is just another flaw of the brain. And I think that we need to take it seriously, because we are spending so much time online. If you actually look at the percentage of humans today who use social media and the amount of time that they spend using social media, it comes out to like 10 or 11% of the entire world's attention is spent on social media. Like, if you think about how crazy that is, and that's not including like sleep, right? So we're sleeping, I don't know, 33% of the day. We're spending 11% of us on social media. That is eating up a huge chunk of our lives. But I'm concerned that we're not taking it very seriously, because the repercussions of the online harassment, which is so prevalent, are very serious. The number of cases of suicide, in America, it's awful, and especially in young people. And of course, there's also evidence showing that those who have been exposed to online harassment, especially young people, they're at like 2.5 times higher risk of attempting suicide. What are we doing about this, right? We are doing nothing to, I hate to use the word police, but to police the internet and to protect young people. And I think that's a massive oversight. I really, I'm not saying that we should big brother, government crackdown, like police the internet, but I mean, what the hell are we doing, right? If you can let your kids on the internet and they can be attacked by each other, they can be trolled by bots, that is not something that the policymakers can even understand. When most of these policymakers, when they're much older, when they were kids, there was just absolutely no such thing. And so this idea is just foreign to them, that your life, your upbringing, and the way that you see yourself and your identity and your relationship to the world can be shaped by these bizarre online forces, often in negative ways. It's like too foreign to handle. And I think, I don't know, we tend to sort of apply this insignificant, sort of trivial, juvenile filter and lens over social media. It's like, it's just the internet. But it has real implications in our daily life, and we're using it a lot. So I don't know.
I think it's just growing way faster than we can comprehend. And that's why we feel, well, yeah, I was on, like, I'm thinking as a dad, somebody could be like, well, yeah, I've been on Facebook for 5 years. It's not that bad. But what they don't realize is like your feed is not that bad compared to your 13-year-old daughter, who could be a completely different feed, right? The filtering thing, didn't they just try something in UK where if you're going on any porn website, you need to upload your ID?
I've heard about things like that.
Then there's the balance, right? Because on one hand, you want to protect the society, but then on the other hand, now there's this government employees that's sitting there with your data knowing what you watch, and that could be a big problem, right? Like it's a complex problem, right? So my my quick question on that is, if so much of our life is online and we understand all these problems and we understand that our brain is less empathetic online, how what can we do to make our connections feel more deeper or more human? Like, I understand if you just think for a second, like, dude, what are you doing? Well, like, there's actually apps nowadays where when you type a text, it tells you like, stop it, you're being ridiculous, right? And then it's not gonna fix it, but it gives you a second. And even if one person changes their tone and they're less mean, that's a win. But what can we do ourselves above and beyond these filters and apps?
Yeah, and I've seen that too, that on like Instagram or Facebook or something like that, they rolled out something similar where it's like, before you post a comment, it's like, halt, let's think about this comment, right? Like, what the hell are you saying? Could you rephrase that in a more polite way? I think so. The way that I ended up at that hypothesis was because I had a personal experience that changed the way I saw social media. So, like any other day, I opened TikTok. This was like 3 years ago, and this person had uploaded a video and tagged me, and I watched it, and they were basically like, just the entire video was just attacking me. It was like, this guy, he's a narcissist. Everybody knows everybody in neuroscience is a narcissist, and he's cherry picking data, and he's not trustworthy. He's doing it for the attention. And it was just like, I was getting roasted. No idea who this person was. And so I commented on it and I said something like, like, wow, really coming at me today. And I never, I kind of forgot about it after that. And when I opened the app again, I found that this person had commented like, boom, 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 like big paragraphs, super apologetic. Like, oh my gosh, I am so sorry. I didn't think you would see this. I've just had a bad day. It's been a tough week. I was just kind of taking it out on the internet, like super aware of the circumstances. And that's what made me think of like, okay, this is clearly a person with tremendous levels of empathy. Like, they felt bad when they realized that they had hurt me, but before that, they hadn't realized that they had hurt me. It like never occurred to them that there was a real live breathing human on the other end of this, right? You put something out there, and then you're not in the room. And the way I describe this in my book is I use the analogy of like a tack, right? Imagine like you're a child in elementary school and you place a tack upright, hoping to prank one of your friends. And, and then nobody steps on it. You kind of forget about it. And like 2 hours later, in a new class of kids comes in, and one of the kids sits on the tack and starts crying and goes to the nurse. You're in the other room. You've completely moved on. You weren't there to witness them sitting on the tack. Do you feel empathy? Of course not. Why would you feel empathy? You don't even know what's going on. You're not there to witness them step on the tack. The comment is the tack. You're placing this upright tack, and you don't have to be there to watch them step on it. You don't have to feel that empathy, that pain of, oh my gosh, I caused this person suffering. And so I think, what those messages are supposed to do when they say, hey, hold on a second, think about this comment. They're trying to get you to think about what it's like to step on the tack, right? How would it feel to open your comments and find this message? What would you feel like? And this is cognitive empathy, the process of trying to imagine and understand what it's like to be in someone else's headspace. Anybody can do it. We all have this ability, as long as you're above like 6 years old and you have theory of mind where you can, understand what it's like to be in someone else's headspace. You can do this process of thinking, how would this feel? And I think we should all be doing that as much as possible on social media, because there are real humans online, and, the stuff really hurts. There's a lot of evidence showing that it's really bad for us. Aside from that sort of pause and reflect moment, though, one of the sort of silly but interesting hacks that I like to propose is using more emojis. So I know that emojis are often viewed as like childish, right? Kind of silly, goofy.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
My 70-year-old dad sent me a poop emoji the other day, and he lives in India. And I was like, what's going on? And like I was saying earlier, we can't comprehend how fast things are changing. So I sent him some photo of, I don't know, I think there was a plant in our front yard, and he sent me a poop emoji, basically implying I don't like it. This is shit, right? And so I love emojis, and I think
and earlier I mentioned that like it's obviously different when you're interacting online versus in person. Like even a video, right? We lose, like, I can't see your lower body. You can't see mine. I could be doing a jig right now. You have absolutely no idea, right? And if you could see my legs, you would, and see me doing a jig, you would say, wow, this guy's really happy right now, right? There's social information that we're missing out on. We're not capable of eye contact, because I have to look in my camera. You have to look in your camera. We are therefore not looking at each other. We're missing out on these social cues. So when you keep on stripping away more and more until you get to just a text interaction where you're messaging with your dad or with someone on social media, so much of that social information has been removed that there's very little for the brain to perceive and say, that's the emotion this person is feeling. Normally our facial expressions and our vocal tone, they shape all that information for our brains. When it's just a text, there's nothing to see unless you use emojis. If you throw an emoji in there where you're like, hey, hope you have a great day, and you throw in an emoji with rolling eyes, it's like, whoa, that totally changes the tone of the message, right? Yeah, it's sarcastic. Yeah, that's a screw you message, right? Or if you say, hey, I hope you have a great day, and it's, a crying, laughing emoji, maybe, it's an inside joke, or it's a smiley face. You're just wishing them a good day, right? There's so much information that can be provided with emojis. And the best part is there's actually some evidence that the human brain, they've measured people's brain responses looking at emojis and looking at human faces. And there's actually some similarities. It's not totally one-to-one, but the way the brain processes emoji faces is similar to how it processes the actual emotion that it's trying to express. So when you think about stripping all these features away from human interaction into a text format, we have the ability to restore some of that information by implanting facial expressions through emojis. And I actually think that could be legitimately beneficial for enriching our online interactions.
it's amazing. So there's all kind of social interactions we have. We have colleagues, we have friends, but then there's these special relationship we have that are so unique, right? What makes our romantic partner, or let's say a parent child bond, so unique? And I'm guessing our brain can see the difference between that versus, a smile at a stranger in a bus.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the main difference is probably the level of oxytocin. I mentioned before, oxytocin is this love hormone. Oxytocin is the primary driver of social reward. So when you have oxytocin flowing in your brain, that's your brain telling you, I like this person. I want to spend more time with this person. So if you think about the relationships where you feel that vibe, right? I really don't want to be apart from this person. I just love being around them. Being around them feels so great. For most people, they're going to say romantic partner, children, right? And it's totally accurate. That's exactly what the research shows, is that people who, these types of relationships trigger an oxytocin driven response in the brain. And so, yes, these relationships might make us feel better because, as I mentioned, oxytocin makes us feel good. But the other thing is that oxytocin has all these amazing health benefits. And again, evolutionary viewpoint, but when we are in a position to mate, right? We find someone, a romantic partner that we love, and we are in a position to reproduce, which is like the hallmark of human and any animal's success on Earth, right? Our goal is to reproduce so that our species continues. We need to be physically fit and prepared to reproduce. So oxytocin has all these off-target benefits, systemic benefits in the brain and body. It's, like anti-inflammatory, neuroprotective. It can help with immune function, like bone support. There's all these great things that oxytocin does for us. And I think that's really important for us to understand, because when we are therefore, in deep romantic love, or we are bonding with a child and we just have so much oxytocin flowing through our bodies want to protect us so that we can protect this child or continue to mate. And we have all sorts of health benefits. And that's rare. That is unlike other bonds. And, I think that's one of the sort of key variables that separates these romantic and, these really special tight bonds from, the buddy that you go out to the bar with once a week or whatever. Your brain isn't falling in love with that person. It is benefiting from that person, no doubt. But to experience these level above bonds is something special for the brain and body.
Okay, cool. I want to talk about inner brain synchrony. That sounds sci-fi. That's like, so what is it really? Like, how do two brains actually sync up?
So I don't believe. Okay, well, first, inner brain synchrony is what it sounds like. It's two brains. If you measure two brains at the same time, which, by the way, the term for that is hyperscanning. Awesome name. If you measure them at the same time, sometimes if people are interacting, they will show the same patterns of activity. So that is interbrain synchrony, that the patterns are synchronized. I don't believe that they're actually doing some sort of like quantum physics dance of like, synchronizing through, like telecommunication. I don't think that's what's happening. I think that what it actually is happening is you're basically just getting on the same wavelength, which is kind of a, funny old expression, but it's true that you are like thinking the same way. You're just on the same page. And so if you're to measure the activity of certain brain areas, it would look the same, because you're totally in a rhythm together. And like this happens to me with my wife all the time, where, and a lot of people have expressed this to me too. They're like, oh my gosh, 100%, you're like in the car on a Saturday and you're just like driving somewhere, and at the exact same moment, you're both just like, oh, we should stop at this place and like get that, breakfast we like or whatever. It's just, that happens to me all the time. And this interbrain synchrony is thought to be supportive for basically like teamwork. It makes sense, right? You're kind of on the same page. And it also seems to be more accessible. It's more likely to happen between two brains who are basically on the same team or have some shared interest or are sharing the same experience or are working together. And there's even some evidence that when this happens, it improves the performance of those groups. It's interesting because there's also evidence that it doesn't improve the performance of the group. So it might be sort of task dependent. It only helps with certain things. But it's an amazing feature of our brains that we probably wouldn't know about if not for the amazing contributions of neuroscience to humanity. And that's something I'm personally curious about, is like when I do feel like I'm on the same page as someone, we're really like on the same wavelength. Like, is that actually interbrain synchrony? And I don't think there's any research on that, like characterizing the subjective experience of interbrain synchrony. I don't think anyone's actually looked at that.
Got it. And you plan on working on that? Is that like a future thing you want to do in the?
Um, Not until now, but that's a good question. Maybe I will. That's cool. Yeah, I should write that down.
Yeah.
I'm
So
gonna write it down right now.
yeah, no, take your time.
I just wrote
So
a little note in my hand.
what does science say that really makes someone likable? Is it the charm or looks? Is there something deeper? Because attraction is very subjective, right? Somebody could be traditionally really beautiful, but then someone else could find them annoying. Like, what is going on in our brain when it comes to like, how can somebody be more likable than other?
There's a lot. There's a lot that goes into likability, and as you've already noted, of course, it's very subjective. Um, there are not very many people who are universally loved, right? There's always some people who are like, oh, I can't stand that person. Like, you think that comedian's funny? Like, I hate that guy. It happens all the time. But there are there have been studies done on, like, generally, statistically, what are likable traits. And you mentioned one, attractiveness. I think, unfortunately, is one of the like big predictors of likability. We have this tendency to assume, anybody who's taken a psychology class has probably heard this before. This, like, beauty is good stereotype, or beautiful is good stereotype, or the halo effect, where it's like someone is good looking and your brain is just assuming that they're like spectacular at everything. They're more trustworthy, they're more likable, whatever. It's kind of a shallow tendency of the human brain, but there's so much more than that too. And this is definitely one of those topics where it is much better explained by the chapter of the book. I have a whole chapter on likability than me, because I cannot possibly remember all the different things. But a few of them that come to mind are like how expressive someone is. If someone's really emotionally expressive and they're they're really easy to read, they tend to be more likable. And there are also these other sort of less known, or like less openly recognized things, like mimicry. So, for example, if you're actually mimicking the body language of the person you're interacting with, you're more likely to, or that if that person's mimicking you, you're more likely to like them, which is interesting because people don't even notice this, but it happens all the time. Like right now you have your arms folded. Like if I were to start standing like this, and then at the end of the interview, a researcher gave you a form and said, how much did you like Ben? You would probably like me more because I was doing this. Yeah, very interesting. Now I'm going to mimic you for the rest of the interview. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, and it's funny because they've done studies like that where they actually had, people come into the lab and meet with someone, and they didn't know the person they were meeting with was an actor, and the actor was intentionally mimicking their body motions. Not like totally miming them, right? That would be weird, but just sort of kind of generally approximating their body positions. And when they did that, the people they reported liking the person more. And it's thought because this is sort of an affiliative behavior, right? It's like, look what we have in common, right? You're in this position and so am I, right? It's this kind of this signal that the brain picks up on subconsciously. And the other thing too is we do it subconsciously. So if you are in an interaction and you look down and you're like, I'm standing with my hands on my hips and my one foot out to the side, and the person's in the same position too, like, did I do that first or did they do that first? Who followed the other person? Like we often just do this without even thinking about it. But it's kind of like the silent processing systems in the backs of our brains trying to communicate with each other and say, hey, we're trying to build a relationship here. It's like you don't control the behavior. You don't really notice that they're mimicking you, but it changes your impression of that person. And, like I said, there's a lot of examples like this in the book that I walk through, but I have such a hard time keeping track of all of them. There's just so many, but yeah, it's amazing.
Well, read the book for listeners. Well, everybody read the book, right? Like,
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that would be my goal is to really change minds. I want people to understand that interaction is important and truly just understand like why it matters. And so, yeah, the book's also interesting though. I, of course, as you could probably tell by the examples I'm sharing, I worked really hard to incorporate fascinating science, the kind of stuff where you can talk about it at a bar or at a party and blow people's minds, because there's some really fascinating science out there that's unfortunately been held behind paywalls and jargon for decades. And a major goal of mine is to get the research out from behind those paywalls and barriers and allow people to appreciate it and use it in their lives. So
let's talk about drugs. So, alcohol too. Yeah, let's talk about drugs, right? Um, Alcohol, antidepressants, psychedelics. How do different drugs change the way we connect with others socially? Because, I mean, I'm sure you've seen, right? Like, a lot of time people behave differently when they had a beer. It's just they're more social, right? It's like, so what is going on in our brain?
I mean, going back to when I mentioned I've done a lot of stupid things when I was young. I mean, gosh, how many of those times was I under the influence of alcohol? A lot of them. I what alcohol does to the brain is there's a lot of things, but it's generally a nervous. You probably heard of it called a nervous system depressant. People say, "Oh, alcohol is a depressant. It's a downer," right? That doesn't mean it makes you depressed. It means that it reduces the activity of brain cells, because the way alcohol works in the brain is it modifies the function of GABA receptors. GABA is a neurotransmitter that turns down the activity of brain cells. And the way I like to explain this is like, if you imagine that your neurons have a bunch of air conditioners plugged in all over them, those are like GABA receptors. And so when GABA comes along, it turns on the air conditioner and the cell gets cooler. It gets less active, right? The activity goes down. But what alcohol does is it basically like turns up the intensity on those air conditioners. So now when your brain sends GABA, much more cold air is blowing into the cell. So the cell is just much more likely to be inhibited. And so, it's a depressant. It turns down the activity of brain cells. But, that has a number of consequences. One of them being, in areas like the prefrontal cortex, which are doing those things like we mentioned earlier of making judgments about what is right and wrong and what's acceptable and socially acceptable and unacceptable, that brain area starts to turn down. And so you become more reliant on these impulses. You're less thoughtful about, hey, should I make a move on this person? Should I go in for the kiss? Or, this guy just bumped me. Should I shove him and start a fight? Right? Like normally the front of your brain would be like, hold on, not sure that they want to kiss right now, or not sure that you should fight this person. Is it really worth it? But with those brain systems turned down, you're much more likely to act uninhibited and really more reliant on impulses. On the other end of this sort of axis, because the in the brain we have these sort of more like these limbic systems that are emotions. They're basically emotion processing. They contribute to decision making. These are like our amygdala, things like that. And then we have our frontal cortex, which has sort of like, it's like the big brother. It's like putting the brakes on the amygdala. It's like, take it easy, let's not fight that guy. The amygdala is also turned down. And there's actually evidence showing that alcohol has a similar effect on the brain as benzodiazepines like Xanax, anti-anxiety medications, which is probably why people like to crack open a beer after a long stressful day, because it's kind of taking the edge off, right? It's turning down those limbic emotional areas. But that can be good or bad, right? On a stressful day, it can turn down that emotional reactivity. But also, if you have one too many and you're at a social gathering, it can impair your responses, your brain's responses to other people's social signals. So for instance, you make a very distasteful joke about a friend's sibling, and the friend, kind of gives you a look and maybe says like, "Oh my gosh, like that was so insensitive," right? A very strong negative social signal sent your way that's meant to tell you, "Hey, you just insulted me. You broke violated my boundaries." Your brain is going to be less responsive to that. The amygdala response is probably going to be less. which is bad, right? That's like, you should be responsive to that. You should care about other people's feelings. And that's one of the reasons why I argue in the book that alcohol, even though it feels like it makes us better at interacting, because it kind of, it allows us to relax and just be more loose with each other. It actually doesn't make us more effective interactors, right? It actually can, in some ways, can make us worse like that. It depends on the context, of course, right? Sometimes it can be super effective.
Yeah, I mean, if you're someone who's having a trouble saying a word, sure, maybe half a beer will help you. But then for an average normal person, Dr. Andrew Huberman had this whole episode of 3 hours on alcohol. And these 3 hours, he keeps going, I know you guys are waiting for me to tell you good news, but trust me, there isn't one. I've heard one glass of wine a day is. He's like none, zero. Like it's just, it was fascinating when I listened to that episode. It was like, okay, so there isn't really much going on other than the way it makes you feel short term, right? Like very, yeah, high preference.
Yeah, I mean, it's a neurotoxin too. Like it's bad for the health of brain cells. Period. Right. So the more you drink, the more bad harm you're doing to your brain cells. And the studies that he looks at and references a lot. There's a recent one showing that basically people who drink, I might be misquoting this, I believe it was people who drank more than two beers or more than two drinks per week were at a higher risk of dementia or maybe even Alzheimer's disease. So, I can't remember if it was, because dementia is a symptom. It's the, sort of confusion and trouble with memory. And whereas like brain atrophy and the brain shrinking and neurons dying, that's Alzheimer's disease. So I can't remember which one it was, but basically the prognosis is bad. The more you drink, the worse it is. And so he suggests drinking no alcohol at all. I mean, I agree with the concept that somebody who drinks 0 drinks per year is going to have a healthier brain than someone who drinks even 2 per year, or I'm sorry, 2 per week, let's say. But also, someone who drinks 2 per week is going to probably have a healthier brain than someone who drinks 12 per week, right? This is a kind of a slider. And of course, also, we all have this genetic predisposition, right? Some of us, like, there's also, I know he talks about the link between alcohol and cancer, right? Some people may have genetic predispositions to cancer that alcohol can accelerate. And so some people, I can't always say that someone who drinks 2 beers a week is healthier than someone who drinks 12, because if that person who drinks 2 is predisposed to cancer, they might end up with cancer when the person with 12 doesn't. And so it's all very nuanced and complex, but totally. I mean, alcohol is not a drug that is healthy. There are very few drugs out there that make you healthier, of course, in the context of a person who's already healthy, right? Obviously, there's tons of drugs where if you have some sort of condition, the drug will help you. But yeah, alcohol is a drug that we use as healthy people. Well, it depends on how you're defining like healthy. And I'm thinking of a specific purpose, like, okay, I mean, I guess to argue against myself, you could say if your goal is to become more less socially anxious because social anxiety is harming your life, then alcohol could theoretically make you healthier, right? Yeah. Yeah, but there are also, I mean, there are there are like supplements out there. I'm not a big supplement fan at all, and I know there, my as a academic scientist, whenever someone on the internet says take this supplement, I think you're full of shit. That's generally my impression. But I have to admit, I've been doing this supplement series on social media. I call it "Do Supplements Really Work?" where I do a full literature review and I share like, here's the evidence on whether this supplement actually does anything. And there are a couple that are actually really good. And so like, I would say like omega-3s, that's probably one that makes a healthy person healthier. Although again, biology is such that it's really difficult to take a system that's already working fine and make it better, right? It's like, imagine you have your iPhone and it's working fine. Do you think you could open up the circuit board and make some change that makes it more efficient? No way. But if your iPhone's broken and you open up the circuit board and you realize, oh, this is broken, let me fix that, it might fix it, right? So biology is, it's really hard to improve because it's already pretty damn optimized. But if you have if you have a deficiency, you're deficient in magnesium or you're deficient in vitamin D, right? You take those supplements, you're gonna be healthier and you're gonna feel better maybe. But if you have just fine levels of vitamin D, does taking it do anything? I don't know. It's definitely going to have less of an impact than if you had no deficiency to begin with. Yeah, I do. I mean, so the two examples I just said, vitamin D and magnesium, I have deficiencies in both of those, and I take both of those. Um, Other than that, I try to take an omega-3 as often as I can. I don't really, I don't know. I'm not like fully convinced, right? Like there's studies showing that people who have higher intake of omega-3s are at lower risk of various things. I can't remember, heart disease, things like that. And so it's like, sure, what do I have to lose? And I think that's also the distinction where it's like, if I take more omega-3s, I'm not going to have like a hangover, but with alcohol, I'm doing damage. And so it's explicitly toxic in many ways where it's not a great one to drink a lot alcohol. But other than that, yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I mean, magnesium I take almost every night before bed, and I have a magnesium deficiency, and there's a noticeable difference in my sleep when I take magnesium. I sleep much better, and I actually like that is one of the ones that I'm pretty like evangelical about. Like I will tell people, I have multiple friends they're complaining to me about their sleep, and they're like, "What do you think I should do?" And I'm like, "Try magnesium." And I've had multiple people be like, "That changed my life." Yeah, it's kind of comes back to the same reason that humans are motivated to be around each other. Humans and dogs survive really well in groups. We work really well together. And so being together at some point in history increased our survival chances for both of us to the point that our brains started to take on adaptations to make us want to be together. And so if you look at like dogs evolved from wolves, domestic dogs, like my dog Zoe, she has a great 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 a billion times back grandfather and grandmother who were wolves. And so does every dog. They all come back to some common ancestor. But anyways, um modern dogs have evolved these traits where they actually kind of tickle our brain systems like babies do. When you look at your dog and your dog looks at you, research has shown that both of you show this rise in oxytocin. Same thing that happens when a parent looks at their child. It makes you think, gosh, I love this beast. I want to spend more time with this animal. I want to cuddle it, right? I love it. And the thing that's interesting is that if you do the same thing with wolves, wolves don't show a rise in oxytocin, right? At some point, dogs took this on to bond with us specifically. But what's important to recognize here is that, again, oxytocin has all sorts of health benefits. And so I actually believe that building interactions with a dog into your life can be a like legitimately effective way to supplement the loss of interaction. So if you're a person who has spent less time interacting over the last few years, I actually think that interacting with the dog can sort of tickle some of those same biological systems in a way that can make up some of the difference. I'm not saying that if a person lived their entire life in isolation but just with a dog, that would not be healthy either. But I think I think a lot about older people who are very isolated. It's really not a good thing. Really, an unspoken health crisis as well. I mean, gosh, having a dog, I think, could be really a significant difference in the well-being of those folks because it hits on those oxytocin systems, makes us feel good. And there is also evidence, just like there's evidence that humans who spend more time together, who are more social, less likely to die, less likely to develop Alzheimer's and dementia and those things. There's evidence that people who have dogs are also healthier. There's, I can't remember the exact linkages, but it's that, people with pet dogs are less likely to experience like cardiac failure, certain things like that, where it's like, we're basically just healthier. People who are around dogs are just healthier and just at less risk of health complications.
You mentioned older folks, and it reminds me of this incident happened in Japan where this gentleman was living in an apartment. He was getting Social Security, and he had all his bills paid from his account. He passed away, and it was weeks until anybody found out because there was no reason for anyone to ever go see him. It was everything was paid for. He had the air conditioner on, and it just the body just rotted. It's just tragic. But just sticking to the topics. So I understand how we perceive dogs, but do dogs actually see their caregiver the way children see their parents? Do we know?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think so. It's kind of like, do animals experience empathy? Well, like it seems like it from what we can tell. We don't know, obviously. Um, but yeah, I mean, there's first off, from a neurobiological standpoint, there is evidence that dogs show different brain activity when they look at their caregiver versus when they look at a random person. They show increased activity in this brain area called the caudate nucleus, which is associated with like pleasure and reward. So there's some evidence that your dog at least is more it's hard to say, does that mean that they're happier around you, or does that mean that they associate you with rewards because you're the person who typically gives them treats? You could go either way, right? We have to be scientifically balanced about how we interpret these findings, but there's a bunch of other evidence too. I mean, the fact that, like I said, when dogs look at humans, they have a rise, or when they look at their caregiver specifically, they show a rise in oxytocin. There's really no other explanation for that than their brain is trying to get them to form a bond with you. And it's the same thing that happens in infants with their parent. So I would say yes. Another piece of evidence comes from like their behavior. Obviously, anybody who has ever had a dog is like, of course my dog loves me, right? They treat me special. They care about me. But there's also some more, you might say, I guess, esoteric evidence that when dogs are put into uncomfortable situations, they basically feel more comfortable and act more comfortably if their parent or their caregiver is nearby. And what's interesting about this is that this is exactly what infants do. So if you put a child into a strange situation, the strange situation test created by Mary Ainsworth, they will basically be like unsure. The majority of infants, 70% or so, will be a little bit anxious and unsure about their environment if their parents aren't there. But then when the parent returns, they become confident again, and they see their parents as sort of like a secure base that they can, maneuver around and behave as long as the parents are there. Like, I'm safe, and that's kind of how dogs are too. And so I think there's a lot of reason to believe that dogs not only truly love us, but also view us as their the way that children view their parents. And as a longtime dog owner and dog lover, it warms my heart to see the science support what I always thought was true.
What's your dog's name?
Zoe.
If you don't, yeah, Zoe. That's
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah, she's a
Why?
sweetheart.
That's awesome. Why is it helpful to have a dog growing up? So we understand kids like it emotionally, right? But is there like a social and a brain development too with kids just because they have a dog?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, this is sort of one of the hypotheses that I propose in the book, is that having a dog in early life is part of that process of like shaping the prefrontal cortex. Because when you have a dog, you need to learn to understand what it's thinking without it being able to tell you what it's thinking, right? And that is quite the exercise for the developing brain. If we are
Right.
able to learn how to interpret the emotions of a being that cannot speak, that's really powerful. And so I think that it's important for shaping empathy. And there's actually some evidence to support this as well, that children who grow up with dogs, they basically seem to act more considerate of others, and of course they also understand dogs better. People who grow up in cultures where dogs are kind of welcomed and accepted, they show more sort of astute understanding of dog emotions, which obviously means that something is clicking up here. They're learning something.
That's awesome. Well, this is it for me. This was so helpful. Thank you. Thank you so much for this. Can we quickly summarize and talk about your book? So the book's coming up. Tell us where can people buy that? Where should our listeners go follow you? Where are you most active?
Yeah, well, thanks. The book is called Why Brains Need Friends. I have an early copy here, so you can recognize it by the hugging brain on the cover. But yeah, the book can be
Who
found.
designed it? That's such a brilliant
Thank you.
design.
Yeah, so the book is being published by Penguin Random House, biggest publisher in the world, and their design team came up with that. We had two
That's
designs.
awesome.
Another
Yeah.
one I really liked. I don't even. I'm assuming I'm allowed to talk about it publicly. It was like a brain, and then the waves, the wrinkles of the brain were
Right.
arms, and they all had hands, and they were like shaking hands and high fiving and fist bumping. It was such a cool design, and I actually liked that one better at first, and then I ended up changing my mind and going with this one. It's so funny when you make a book. It's like you just like make decisions. It's so odd because you just like you're typing on a Microsoft Word document and it feels so like fake, and then all of a sudden it's like printed in a book and it's like, holy cow, this is this is
Yeah.
real.
It's real now.
It's
Yeah.
but I mean, I really enjoyed writing the whole writing process and everything. Anyways, so it's called Why Brains Need Friends. You can get it anywhere. It comes out October 14th in America. It's also going to be published internationally. We have, I think, 14 or 15 languages covered at this point. Sure to add more. So I'm sure, you can find it in almost any language at some point in the next year or two. But yeah, you can get it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target, whatever, you name it. And I can send you the link if you want to put it in the
We
caption,
will.
which,
We'll put it in the show note. I know you're very active on Instagram. Is there
yes.
anywhere else you like to
Yeah.
share? Yeah, please.
Yeah, let me add that. That's a good point. Yeah, so I do short form video content, typically 1 to 2 minutes, just these like bite-sized neuroscience learnings. And I'm active on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, pretty much anywhere that you can upload a video. But TikTok and Instagram are my main channels, and my handle is just at Dr. Ben Rein, Rein.
Yeah, we'll put that in the show notes. Thank you so much, Doc. This was awesome.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you having me, and thanks for all the questions. Great questions.
Awesome. All right. Good luck on the book launch.
Thank you.
Bye.